So welcome to The Nature of Mind. In The Nature of Mind, we're exploring mind from all kinds of different perspectives. We're looking at neuroscience, we're looking at psychology, and we're looking at Buddhist thought. And today we've invaded the home of Dr. Penny Sartori. We've turned up here in Swansea on a Sunday morning to ask her about near-death experiences. Penny was one of the first people in the UK to study near-death experiences. She was a nurse for 21 years and worked in ITU for 17 years. So she's got direct experience of people talking to her a lot about near-death experiences. And of course, we're really interested in what does that say about mind? What does that say about consciousness? So welcome, Penny. It seems weird to welcome you in your own lounge.
Well, welcome. Welcome to my home.
Yeah, very nice to be able to come. Thank you very much for letting us barge into your life on a Sunday morning. So I thought we'd just start with that experience you had as a nurse, I don't know, 21 something more years ago, that started all this for you. Say a little bit about that to start with, I thought.
Well, it was all happened on a night shift, and I was looking after a man who was clearly dying, and he had quite a prolonged and suffering death. And I remember looking after him on this night shift. He'd just come back from the operating theatre and he was in terrible pain. The nurse had handed over to me, and it was routine to bed bath our patients in the night. And so I just got everything ready, prepared to give him a bed bath. And I said, we're going to have a bed bath now. And as I touched the electric bed to put the bed flatter, the man nearly jumped out of bed in agony. And at that point, our eyes connected. And I felt almost as if I'd swapped places with him. And he was mouthing to me. He couldn't talk because he had a tracheostomy. And he was mouthing the words, "Leave me alone, let me die, just let me die in peace." And it made me stop what I was doing. And I thought, oh my goodness, I'm not helping this man at all. So I called the doctor and he came and reviewed and gave him some extra medication. He was already on phenomenal amounts of morphine as it was. And so I thought, right, I need to bed bath him, but if I do that, I'm going to cause him more pain. So I pulled the screens around and I sat with him and I just held his hand. And when he'd settled, I washed the parts of his body that I could reach with his permission. And I kind of let him settle then. But that had such a profound effect on me. I couldn't stop thinking about it all night. And the following day when I went home from work, I couldn't sleep after my night shift. And I phoned work about mid-morning to find out how he was doing. And my colleague said, he died about half an hour after you left. And that sent me into a bit of a depression, really. And I think that was when my spirituality first began to emerge, because I started to go within. And that depression, I think, although it was depression, I was able to work through it. It was awful. I would never want to go back there again. But, coming out the other end, it made me see things very differently as well. And so it made me interested in what happens when we die. Is it the end of everything? Are we annihilated? Or is there something more? And I started reading all that I could about death. And I looked at it from different perspectives as well. And then I came across near-death experiences. And I was quite blown away. And I just thought, wow, these people are saying that death is nothing to be afraid of. And I think initially, because nursing is an evidence-based profession and very scientific, I kind of thought it was probably some sort of hallucination. But the more I read about them, the more curious I became. And I just thought, well, I'm working in intensive care. This is the obvious place to do some research. And from that point, that's what happened. I was able to do some research and it changed my life.
We're going to come onto near-death experiences in a minute and talk more about your research. But it's interesting because we have something in common that you've been a nurse for 21 years. I was a nurse for about, I can't remember how long I was a nurse, but not very long, about 5 years. I was a staff nurse in urology in Walsgrave in Coventry. And I thought I'd say a little bit about, because I had a similar experience to you.
Right.
Your experience there reminded me of mine when I was training to be a nurse. We had a gentleman admitted, again, late at night. He was sort of very, clearly dying, not speaking and so on. And I don't know what it was like in your day, probably the same, but I said I want to sit with him if he's dying, and the sister was saying, look, we haven't got, and understandably, we haven't got time, you never got enough staff, have you? You know, that's, so you can never do those things very easily. But I was new and kind of insisted. And as I sat, I never met the man before, as I sat there, he was sort of asleep, as it were. And suddenly he suddenly opened his eyes and, just like you were saying, looked at me very directly. And it was as if he communicated directly to me. He seemed to suddenly wake up to the fact he was about to die. And in the same moment, wake up to the fact that he hadn't lived. And then he burst into tears and he died.
Wow.
And it was that experience, looking back on it, there I was in Coventry in my nurse training. I think that's one of the experiences that drew me to Buddhism. But it's interesting because when I've tried to explain it to people think it's a judgment I put on top of it, and made a moral judgment. But it felt like that's what he told me with his gaze. He didn't say anything. It felt like a sort of directly, I knew what he was. A little bit like what you're saying. I don't know whether that...
Yeah, absolutely, that resonates with me. Yes, definitely. So it was like more of an empathic experience, really, in that I could feel everything that he was going through. And it made me question what I was doing as a nurse. I thought, what am I doing to this man? I'm not being of any comfort to him. And that's when I changed what I was doing to doing my tasks, which I should have been doing, and I sat with him instead and held his hand, and that was the only thing that actually did settle him, you know.
Yeah, it's so easy as a nurse to sort of do what you're sort of told to do, which is always make beds and do a bed bath.
That's right.
In the old days, whether that's true.
Exactly, and this man had been in intensive care for quite some weeks as well, and so his whole life had been under the control of the routine of ITU. You know, we turn them every 2 hours, we suction their chests, oral and eye care. You know, it's all those different things that we're doing to them, so they never get any proper rest. And this man was in the last few hours of his life, you know, and it was a real privilege to be there with him as well, because that was it for him, you know. And it's a shame that it ended in that way that it did for him as well. And I think what it did for me then is it opened my eyes, and so everyone I was looking at in intensive care, all of those patients, I thought this might be the last few hours of their life. So I think it's really important that we're able to recognise that and, you know, to give that care and that appropriate care for patients at the end of their life as well.
Indeed. Before we get on to, your research in near death, I thought it'd be really good, because I don't think we talk enough about experiences, like after death, communication and near-death experiences, because you talk again about an experience that you had as a nurse which really resonated with me. Perhaps you might tell that story of having a handover from the night nurses.
Well, that's certainly when I was a student nurse, and I can remember it was my very first day on the ward as a student nurse, and I was sitting there, quite anxious, and so the night nurse was handing over, and she said, "Oh, the man in section C, bed 6, he'll be dead by the end of the night. He's been talking to his dead mother since about 3 o'clock." And I thought, and I looked around thinking, are they winding me up because it was my first day? And everyone else carried on as if it was nothing out of the ordinary. So I was really quite curious about this. So after the handover, I went out to this patient, and he was just lying in bed at that point. And then I was going back and forth throughout the morning. I had other nursing duties in other areas of the ward, but I'd go back and I did observe him quite clearly, kind of communicating with someone I couldn't see. And then it was about 11:30 in the morning, and he kind of got energy from somewhere, and it's as if he was trying to sit up, and he had this lovely smile on his face, and his arms went up like that, and then he kind of just laid back down, and as if he was going to sleep, but he actually died at that point. And so I thought, wow, that night nurse was right. Everything that she said has come true. And so that made me quite curious at that point as well, But again, I kind of just dismissed it, that this was just some sort of hallucination at the end of life,
I wonder, you say a bit, because you've written a bit about end-of-life experiences. And then, there's a lot at the moment being said about near-death experiences, but not so much said about these kind of, which I remember. I remember people talking to people, and and again, it was just like, oh, that's what happened. Doesn't really mean anything.
Yeah, that's it.
It's very well known amongst nurses, isn't it? That,
absolutely, yes. And I think if you talk to most nurses, they could recall experiences where they've observed something similar, but maybe not attached any meaning to it. But it's something that does happen with patients, and sometimes they can be in and out of consciousness as they approach the end of their life. And sometimes you might see them gesturing. They might talk of going on a journey, packing a suitcase, waiting for the train to arrive or waiting for their bus to arrive. And at this point of life, you see all of these sort of things working out for them. It's common for them to have conversations that we can't see. But it's something that is often observed, but sometimes it's just kind of put down to delirium or something like that, when sometimes it can be quite meaningful. And I think something at the end of life that happens as well is that patients might get agitated at some point as well. You might see them working through agitation, and sometimes that may be mistaken for physical pain, whereas sometimes it could be spiritual pain as well. So there's things that they haven't worked through in their life. Maybe they've been estranged from a family member, and they want to make amends, and so those things can be playing on their minds as well. And also as well, things from their past might come back to them as well. There's a lot been written on reminiscence in the elderly, and certainly on people's deathbeds, they tend to reminisce as well and go back and talk about things that might have happened in their past as well. But it's a privilege to be around someone like that as well at the end of their life. But I know when my grandfather was dying, we nursed him at home, and the few days before he died, he started seeing someone in the doorway, and he used to point and say, look who's there. And my grandmother used to get really spooked by it, and she used to run out. And at the time, I'd never heard of these experiences, and I kind of dismissed it. I didn't explore it any further. But now, in retrospect, having done my research, I'm really, I missed an opportunity there to speak about this in depth with my grandfather as well.
Because there's all sorts of phenomena that can happen near death, aren't there? You were saying about electrical. It has electrical effects sometimes.
Yeah, sometimes you might see lights flickering, things like that. When people die, it's common for clocks to stop as well. I know someone has written to me when their member of family died at home, and they had about 10 different clocks in the house, and they all stopped at the same time. And that was the wind-up clocks and digital clocks as well. So I find that quite fascinating as well. Some people describe maybe seeing a light leaving the body. I've never seen it myself. Some people sense coldness around the bed. Again, it's something I've not sensed, but one of my colleagues I used to work with used to sense it all the time, and she was usually very accurate as well, So there's different phenomena that happen around the time of death.
And there's also a phenomenon of after-death communications that you write about. Yeah,
so it might be that, people can kind of communicate in different ways, maybe through dreams and things like that. And there's another thing as well that really fascinates me, and that's the empathic or shared death experience. So this is where people who are at the bedside of the dying person can share in like a partial journey into the light with the person who's dying. And I got quite a few cases of that. And I think the most vivid case that springs to mind is a man who wrote to me when I was still studying for my PhD at Lampeter University. And he was trying to make sense of something that happened when his wife had died. And he said, I really don't understand what happened. But he said, we were in the hospital room with my wife. She was taking her last breaths. And he said, I was holding one hand. My daughter was stroking her forehead, and my son was the other side of the bed. And he said, my daughter said, oh, look what's happening. Look, mum's walking on a path. And he said, all of a sudden, it was as if he was on a path next to his wife, and they were walking towards this bright light on the path. And at the end of the bright light was like a group of people. And out of that group, a very tall man stood, and he came out and he had his arms extended like that. And he could only go so far. And then his wife continued without him. And she embraced this man, and he said, "I've never felt such intense love in all of my life." And he said, this all-loving embrace. And he said, "I felt it, and my daughter felt it as well." And he said, and then all of a sudden, we were back in the room, and my wife had just taken her last breath. And he said, "It's something I've never been able to understand, because what should have been the saddest day of my life, I had a big smile on my face because of what I'd experienced." And I spoke to his daughter independently as well. And she said, "I'll never fear death after having that experience with my mum as she was dying." The son didn't have any of that experience, but the daughter and husband did. And he said, when we were left the hospital, I was quite embarrassed because I had this smile on my face, and I was thinking the staff might think, what are they going to think? So, yeah.
What do you make? I mean, a skeptic would say, well, they're just sort of hallucinatory or empathic hallucinatory experiences. But what do you make of it? I mean, do you make something of it? Because you've been studying it,
Yeah. Well, I think it's to do with our understanding of the mind and consciousness, really, because I think the current scientific kind of understanding of consciousness is that the brain produces consciousness, and then when the brain stops, so does consciousness stop. And yeah, that seems quite logical. But then when you account for all of these experiences and you look at these experiences, the people at the bedside, their brains weren't dying. They weren't starved of oxygen or anything like that. But they had a very clear experience which influenced how they lived their life after that as well. And so for me, having done this research, the best explanation for me is that consciousness is primary and consciousness is around us all the time. But our brains, if you like, filter out that consciousness. But there are times in our life when that filter action becomes more relaxed. And so these experiences come into our everyday consciousness. So I think that makes more sense for me, because when someone's near death, so it's an acute situation, they might have had a car accident, they might have had a cardiac arrest. So there's a very acute interruption to the brain, to and so that filter action within the brain is widening, if you like. And so, rather than creating anything, it's allowing something into our experience that's usually screened out. And I think that just makes more sense to me,
Okay, yeah, yes, indeed. So we'll start to move towards, all the studies you've done on near-death experience. Before I ask you to sort of tell us a bit more about, because there are all these common factors that I think it'd be really good to have people get an awareness of. But the other thing striking about your personal story is that you were one of the first people in the UK to study near-death experiences, but also you did it in your own time, didn't you? You were working as a nurse. It's not like you suddenly got all this funding and gave up your job and you seemed really, really committed to it. There's a point in the book where you talk about how exhausted you were trying to do your work and trying to do this. Yeah. Because you did a 5-year study, wasn't it? Something
that's right.
A long study, which is I think the first long study in the UK.
Yes.
So what made you so committed to it, do you think?
I think that experience of looking after that man, when it sent me into that depression, it made me question everything. And so instead of kind of seeking help and going to get antidepressants, I went within. And I think by going within and processing it, it gave me a very different perspective. And then I was able to really deeply engage with near-death experiences. As soon as I read about them, I could feel getting obsessed with them, I really became obsessed with near-death experiences. Wherever I went, I was trying to find books on near-death experiences. And, a friend of mine would say, oh, my auntie had one of those years ago. So I'd go and speak with the auntie and seek people out and then spend time engaging and learning and understanding. And I was really, really hooked with them in such a way, like, never before had I been so obsessed with anything. And I think because I was able to engage with it at such a deep level as well, I think, it's almost like I felt like I'd found my life purpose. And so although it was a lot of hard work, it was really enjoyable work as well. So, I just had this energy from somewhere, and it was as if I was in that state of flow all the time. And, I was never bored of it. So I'd go to work, do my shift and everything. And then I'd come home and I'd be my head in the books again, And it's just the way it was. It was just a subject that really, really fascinating and still does fascinate me, all these years later.
I mean, it's striking to me because for me it makes it more, your story makes it somehow more compelling, because it's not like, well, it comes from your own experience, I suppose. Buddhism is particularly concerned with that things need to be located in your own experience, not sort of a theory that you're,
Right.
but somehow it's grown out of your experience. And I say it's not that you were given a large funding stream to do it.
No. In fact, to do my PhD, I had to reduce my hours as a nurse then. So instead of working full time, I had to reduce my hours to make sure I had the time to write up my work as well,
So let's start to talk about near-death experience, which you've done this 5-year study on. I thought it'd be good just to hear some of the commonest shared experiences that people have reported to you about near-death experiences.
Well, they vary really. So they can start off with viewing the emergency situation from an out-of-body perspective, where they look down on the emergency situation. They can see people around them, what the medical personnel are doing. They might go through a dark tunnel towards a bright light. And although that's a bright light, it doesn't kind of hurt their eyes at all. And sometimes they describe like a magnetic quality about this light, where they're very drawn to it. They might end up in the light and they find themselves in a beautiful garden with lush green grass, vividly coloured flowers. They might meet deceased relatives or friends, and very often the relatives or friends tell them it's not their time, they shouldn't be there. They might have a life review, where they describe reviewing the whole of their life in a matter of seconds, but they can see everything. So they can see the significant things they've done, insignificant things that they've done. And it's just as if it all flashes before their eyes in a matter of seconds. Sometimes they might come to a barrier or a border, a point of no return. That could be a doorway, could be a river or gate or something like that. But they know that if they cross that barrier, they won't come back to life. And very often then, after the experience, sometimes they kind of revive in their bodies and think, what's happened to me? It's like, whoa, that's no other human experience that they can relate to. It's way beyond anything else they've ever experienced. And so sometimes they kind of keep it within. They don't tell anyone. They're afraid to tell anyone because they think that they're going to be labelled as crazy. So they very much keep it to themselves. But sometimes you might find that they want to talk about it. And that's the important thing, how they're responded to then. So if they're met with a dismissive attitude, oh yeah, you were on too many drugs, which is really common to say, it can put them off sharing that experience, and they'll never share it again for the rest of their life. And of course that comes with problems then, because they don't integrate that experience. If they're unable to talk about it, they can't process it and they can't integrate it into their life. And so it can cause all sort of problems for them as well. It can cause relationship problems because their values drastically change. They're not the person they were before the experience. So they can't relate to their spouse anymore. Their values are different. It might be that they might have had high-powered jobs and really well-paid jobs, but all of a sudden things like that don't have any meaning for them at all. And so you might see career changes as well. And maybe people will train as volunteers or train to become nurses as well, or carers, So you see all sorts of differences, changes in their life after the experience as well.
Yeah, it's remarkable. Let's go through some of those, because that first experience about the outer body, that seems very common, doesn't it? Sort of literally seeing the surgeon or whatever. And in your book you talk about things where that's been able to be verified to some degree. Well,
there was one man in my study, patient 10, who actually did have the out-of-body experience. And afterwards, when he regained consciousness, he described everything that had happened. He described the nurse cleaning his mouth with a pink sponge. He described the physiotherapist poking her head around the screens to check he was okay. He accurately described which doctor had examined him, although prior to losing consciousness, that doctor hadn't been on duty. And what he described was very accurate. And I know that because I was there. This happened at the time when I was there looking after that patient. So, you know, he was clearly, when he was deeply unconscious, he was having a very conscious experience where he was able to recall everything that had happened, and only he was out of his body looking down from above. So how do you explain that?
Yes, that's right, yeah.
So
you could see how one temptation is to simply just say, well, I haven't got a category to explain that, so let's just dismiss it.
Yeah.
But I also thought, I'm struck by this, so often there seems to be this journey, you know, and it's a sort of cliche, isn't it, in life, you know, life is a journey and so on. But there seems to be this journey to light, doesn't it?
Yeah.
That seems very common.
Yes, it is. And that kind of journey can change as well, you know, it varies. So whereas some people might just feel drawn towards that light and glide towards it, people, for example, I've got a couple of cases from the Philippines, and there was one where a childhood near cardiac arrest during childhood, and this young girl remembers being in darkness and then seeing a pinnacle of light at the end, and she knew she had to get to the end of that light, and she said she started moving towards it, and they were like giant steps that were much bigger than she was, and it was really quite difficult to get up to that light, and she remembers it being a real struggle to get there, and she got so far but she couldn't go any further, and she revived in the hospital then. And there's another one where a colleague from the Philippines, her grandmother had lost consciousness. She was completely unconscious, and during that time she recalls a journey where she was going up a very steep hill to get to the top of to where the light was as well, you know, and that was an arduous journey as well, difficult. So that, you know, the journey itself can vary from person to person.
And it's so often seems to be the goal is so often associated with light.
Yes.
Is it ever associated with darkness, do you know?
Sometimes, you know, there is the other distressing kind of experiences which don't get discussed very often.
Yes,
and I think
right.
that's a great shame, because that is something that we also need to understand a bit better. So there is more darkness associated with the distressing kind of experiences. And sometimes, you know, with the distressing experiences, people can describe feeling like demons pulling them down into that darkness as well. And that can be a really traumatic experience for people, you know. They might see images of people being tortured as well. They might see images of thunderstorms and lightning, and they might smell burning and things like that. So it can be a really traumatic experience. And I know I've had a few people contact me for help in understanding theirs. And it's really difficult to research that kind of experience because, first of all, you've got the stigma, and people are saying, well, I hear all about these near-death experiences. They're so nice. What about me?
Yes,
Why have I had this distressing? Is it something to do with my moral character? Am I not a good person? And it's not. You know, it's nothing to do with the character of the person. We don't know why people do and why they don't. But when they recall the experience, it can be associated with like post-traumatic stress as well. So it's incredibly important that we do look at them and that we do understand them and be able to provide some sort of help for people as well.
They do seem to be more of the exception, don't they? Is that right?
Yeah, there is. Depending on the kind of research that you look at, and there's very minimal research out there, it's up to around about 14% of all near-death experiences are of the distressing nature.
Do you have your own? I mean, we'll come back into the sort of the more common ones, but do you have your own kind of hunch about those more difficult experiences?
I know it's kind of been suggested that it might be the failure to relinquish the ego. So they're kind of clinging on to life and resisting the experience. And when they kind of relax into the experience, then it might turn into a more pleasant experience. So there's an example of Dr. Rajiv Party. Now, he's an anaesthetist in California, and his near-death experience started off really quite distressing like that. He saw images of people being tortured, and then he had this realization is, gosh, the way I've been living my life, I haven't been living my life at all. And when he had that realization, it changed for him, and it changed into a very pleasant experience then.
So it could be a kind of resistance to the experience.
Possibly, yeah.
Yes, okay. So let's carry on with the, as it were, more sort of, not common, sound the right word, but more typical. So one of the other things, the other things that really interest me is, quite often there's this life review. There's often another world, isn't there? That's very, very beautiful. Like a heaven world of some kind.
Yes.
We're hoping to interview Eben Alexander, and he talks about this remarkable heaven world, really.
Absolutely,
And that seems quite common, but also a life review. I wonder whether you say a little bit about those two elements.
Yeah, so that's interesting because they kind of reflect. I say we would reflect now in normal time, but with the people who have the near-death experience, sometimes they're unconscious for a matter of seconds, and during that time, they can literally see the whole of their life played out before their eyes. And so it can be really significant things, but sometimes things that they have attached no significance to previously. And sometimes when they're reviewing their life as well, it can be quite uncomfortable for them. So they're looking at things that they've done and they think, oh gosh, I wish I hadn't done that. There might be elements of their life that they're ashamed of and they wish that they hadn't. And sometimes they can be accompanied by a being of light. And that being of light that's with them, it's not judging them at all. That being of light is like a source of comfort. And sometimes they'll kind of envelop them with love as they're watching their life review. There are cases in the literature where the being of light is kind of forwarded over a part of their life as well, so that they didn't have to face it. And so it's a very interesting aspect, that life review. But when the people come back to life after having that life review, it kind of guides and influences the way they live their life as a result in the future after having that review.
So it's more than just a set of images, it's a real review, as it sounds like.
Yeah, they're literally living it. And sometimes they can find themselves in the shoes of someone they've interacted with. So if they've been violent with someone, they can feel like what it's like to be on the receiving end of that violence as well. And sometimes, the simplest little gesture, like holding open a door for someone or smiling at someone, they can see the ripple effects of that as well. So it's a fascinating aspect, really.
See, for me, that's very interesting because, one of the things Buddhism would want to say is that your actions matter. And there's such a movement in the world at the moment to think your actions somehow don't matter. But Buddhism has always emphasised that your actions matter. And so it's almost as if in that life review, you're really seeing the effects of your actions, and not judged from outside, but the intrinsic effect of your actions. Yeah,
that's right. And it's not a case of just watching images. They're actually there, reliving it. They're feeling it as well. But they're feeling it from a different perspective as well. So they're wise to what they've done, and that's why they might feel shame or embarrassed by their behaviour.
And what then the other element that I'm struck by is, often there seems to be that you're here too early, or you need to go back, and often there's a meeting of dead relatives and so on that appear in a very benign form. Is that a sort of quite typical experience?
It is, yeah. So if you look at the cases in the literature, a lot of them are kind of like embracing their loved ones and really feel happy to be there with them. But very often they gently tell them, no, it's not your time, you have to go back. But what I found in my research in the hospital is that the relatives are actually quite angry, and they were like, what are you doing here? Get back there.
Oh, really?
They were sort of that attitude with them,
Oh, really?
And one man in particular, he said, I was there in this tunnel, and he said, I met up with a group of friends of mine who were all dead, and they were really angry. They were shouting at me that I was there. He said, I don't know what I'd done. He said, I don't know why I'm here. So I found that quite fascinating. There was another lady and she met her mother, and her mother was like, you get back down there for those children. And
really?
so, it was like not this lovely, you have to go back. They were shouting at them and quite angry.
What do you make of that?
I don't know, really. Is that just typical of Welsh near-death experiences? I don't know.
It's funny as well because Buddhism believes in rebirth, so the idea is that somehow that consciousness is reborn. But I suppose there's a possibility that there's a kind of timeless place.
Yeah, well, that's it, because when they're in this near-death state, time doesn't exist. So they could, if everything that they were recalling, it would take years to experience in real time, but of course they're experiencing it all sometimes in a matter of seconds. So there is no time in that realm where they are. It's like time doesn't exist. What they could be there, think that they're there for 5 minutes, or they could think that they're there for 5 years. They really doesn't have any bearing on it at all.
Yes, indeed. I want to go back now as well to what you were saying about you've got these sort of common experiences, common in that realm, but then people come back, and as you say, one of the points you make strongly in the book is that the importance of people actually listening to that and not dismissing it.
Yeah.
Because the common dismissal is, these are just hallucinations, or like you said, they're just more drugs. What do you make of that? Is there anything in, why are they? Could they be trying to take a sort of skeptical view? Because it's important, isn't it? We're not trying to just believe or disbelieve. We're trying to sort of think, aren't we? And one of the things I've really appreciated about your book is you're clearly just trying to think about it.
Yeah.
You don't have conclusions very much.
No, not at all. There's still more work to be done, And I was quite naive, I think, when I started doing my research. I thought at the end of my 5 years, when I had a conversation with Dr. Peter Fenwick, who was one of my supervisors, he said, where are you going to be at the end of 5 years now then when you finish this? And I thought, I'm going to have all the answers. And how naive was that, It just opened up so many more questions for me that can't be answered. So there's a lot more research that certainly needs to be done. But of course, I was skeptical. Could I prove that they were hallucinations as well?
Yeah.
And so what I did as well is I also listed and documented cases of patients who'd clearly been hallucinating as well. And then I compared the two experiences, and I found that there were differences. So the people who had the hallucinations, when I followed up and interviewed them later, they could rationalise that they'd been hallucinating, and they were quite embarrassed by their behaviour as well. And they thought, gosh, I'm mortified what I did, and all of those things. And when I investigated what they were saying, and I spoke with the nurses who'd been looking after them, very often it was related to conversations going on in the background, noises in the background, the tactile stimulations, the things that we were doing to the patients as well. Whereas when I looked at the patients who'd had the near-death experience, it couldn't be attributed to what was going on in the background. And they were adamant that this was an absolutely real experience. And, a few of them said, unless you've had this experience for yourself, you can't possibly understand it. And they were just absolutely adamant it was real. And of course, that man who did have the out-of-body experience and recorded everything that he said was a very accurate description of what actually happened as well,
And also, aren't it's funny, this word hallucinations, because it makes you think you know what they are, because we actually don't really know what hallucinations are either, because we don't know what the mind is. But aren't hallucinations usually more chaotic and they're not usually so sort of, they're not usually unified, are they? Yeah,
so they can be very random and very bizarre as well. So, whereas the near-death experience tended to follow that pattern, that's journey into the light, meeting with the deceased relatives and things. So there was randomness versus a pattern as well. So very different experiences.
And then what, from your research, what did you discover about... Because lots of people must have told nurses and doctors they've had this experience. And as you say, people, they don't doubt they've had an experience, do they? They don't doubt something. And they seem to often know that they died. They don't seem to say, they don't present with, oh, I had all these dreams, or what happens when they're not believed? Because they must quite often be not believed.
Yeah, well, if they're not believed, they kind of get dismissed and say, oh, yeah, you're on a lot of strong drugs. It was all due to the drugs. But that's not helpful to the people who are going through that, because they need to process it. They need to talk about it. And if it's dismissed, they just think, oh, right, I am crazy. And they're afraid to talk about it. But they know that something really important has happened to them. And, they don't know how to make sense of it. And I remember a good few years ago, there was a lady who was in her 90s, and she wrote to me at the University of Lampeter. And she said, I've read a newspaper article about your work, and I'd really like to thank you, because I had that experience when I was 14 years of age. I told my mother about it, and she told me I must never speak about it. And she said, I've never spoken about it until this point. And she described this wonderful experience that she had, and she was never able to express it or get a deeper understanding of it, which is such a great shame.
Yeah, such a shame. And of course, one of the reasons why, it's difficult, because I'm not therefore suggesting one believes either, from my point of view. I just want to be open to things, like you, I don't know what they mean.
Yeah.
Nobody really knows.
No.
But dismissing something isn't, that's not right either,
No.
because you don't know. So you can't dismiss things if you don't know.
Exactly.
That's, but I can't remember where I was going with that. What was I completely lost my train now. But if let me just try and remember where I was going to go with that. But so yeah, I'm not saying that one should be open to them. I suppose what happens if it's that's where I was going. If presumably the base of it being dismissed is because of a materialist worldview.
Yeah.
That I grew up. I come from a small town in Warwickshire in the Midlands. The basic idea is, I exist in a world that exists. My consciousness is, like you say, a byproduct of my brain. And when I die, that'll be the end of that. That'll be there was no me before. There's no me afterwards. But what interests me there is that materialist view of things, which is so difficult even to realise it's a view, isn't it? It feels like most people don't think of it as a view, they think of it as, well, that's just the case. It's indubitably the case. It's just a fact.
Yeah.
But and what strikes me is that with that view, it's almost all you can do is dismiss it.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, and it's just that we've never explored the possibility that mind is primary. We've not explored that aspect. We've just taken for granted that the brain produces consciousness and that's it. And it's been taken for granted, and it works fairly well. But of course, when you get to these anomalous experiences, then it completely dismisses something which is very valid to patients as well. It's a deeply subjective experience that totally influences how they live their life afterwards. But if you look at, you think about pain, that's very subjective as well. You can't dismiss to patients that they've got pain. They're feeling it, not me. Yes, I would not dream of dismissing the fact that they have pain,
No,
so I think it's so important that we pay attention to these subjective experiences. They're very real to the people who are having them.
Because if you've got this materialist view, because one of the things that Buddhism is saying is that your view creates your experience. So if you think that, that basic view that brain creates consciousness, then that you'll get evidence to confirm that view, won't you?
Yeah.
You get a sort of bias, really. So I wanted to just come on a bit more to the. One of the things that opens out for me there is, I wonder. Nearly all religious traditions have taught there's some kind of afterlife. They teach them. And I want to come back in a minute to the cultural differences that you write about, because I think that's another important strand I'd like to explore with you. But, one of the things that, nearly all religious traditions have said there is some kind of afterlife. And it makes you wonder, I see what you think of this, but it makes you wonder whether that might have come from people's near-death experiences. It might have been that way round, you see what I mean?
Yeah, that's right. Because if you look at all of the founders of the world's faith traditions and things, they seem to have had a kind of near-death experience as well. So it could well be that the near-death experience is the basis of these religious beliefs as well.
Yeah, because there's so much in common, isn't there?
Yeah.
You know, this heaven-like world,
Yeah.
the figure of love that you talk about.
Yes.
Again and again, these descriptions of light,
Yeah.
these descriptions of rising up, and so on.
Yeah,
You know,
absolutely.
it feels very religious, which makes you wonder whether that's one of the reasons why people haven't wanted to go there, because people are a bit nervous of religion,
Yeah.
and you know, for
Yeah.
sometimes a good reason. But it might be that it's from near-death experiences, mightn't it?
Yeah, that could be the basis of religions as well. Yeah.
Yeah, which is quite something to think of, isn't it?
Absolutely.
But I want to talk a bit about what cultural differences have you seen. So one of the things you talk about in the book is that how, like, everyone seems to have them children. It's not just university educated people, for instance.
No.
It's very, you know, everyday people, children,
Yeah.
adults, all different cultures.
Yeah.
I wonder whether you might say a little bit about that.
So with children, they might be more likely to see pets because they've encountered less people who have died as well when they're children. Sometimes they might see relatives who are still living as well with children. But yeah, and they might see kind of more kind of rainbowy type experience sort of things there. Different cultures. So for example, in India, when someone dies, rather than having a life review, what they tend to report is a scene where they meet Chitragupta, the man with the book, and it's a book of deeds of their life, and he looks at the deeds and that decides their fate from that point onwards. So it's, if you like, it's some form of judgment. And so you've got that aspect. You've got then maybe difficulties in getting to the light with different cultures as well. So, you know, it might be like in the Philippines and other places, it's an arduous journey to get to the light. Whereas in the West, it might be much easier. It's the drift into the light. So there are different cultural elements there, really, according to where they're from.
Of course, different cultural elements doesn't mean that the experience is unreal. It just could mean that it's filtered through a particular cultural shape.
Absolutely.
Like you know, you write about a Buddhist practitioner who experienced, you know, being welcomed back by Amitabha into the pure Amitabha. You know, that Amitabha was a Buddha of the West, and you know, and that is what the Amitabha Sutras say, that you are welcomed back. You know, there's a Tibetan Lama, a Ringo Rinpoche, who had a near-death experience that exactly what Tibetan, you know, texts say about what happens when you die. It followed exactly that form.
Yes.
You know? But yeah, so it does seem to change culturally, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
And then, of course, the other thing I wanted to talk about, because one of the things you write about strongly, and you've written a whole other book on, is the effect that these experiences have.
Yeah, they can have such a profound effect on someone, you know. And I think we don't see that, you know, people tend not to see that aspect of it as well. But it really does transform the way in which people live their life and what they do as a result of it as well, you know. So, you know, it can give them that big kind of burst of energy to turn their life into something else, you know. So, for example, Gigi Strehler, who is the founder of NDE UK, she contacted me because she was searching for answers about her experience. She'd had a cardiac arrest in hospital, had been successfully resuscitated, and had had this experience where she felt that she was part of the experience where she was in the void. It took her many years to process this, and she was on a quest to find out more. So she explored it from different religions' perspective. She had lots of therapy to try and understand it. And she realised that there is a need to support people who have gone through these experiences. And so, you know, she has set up NDE UK. She's put in all this work to do that. Her own, funded it herself and everything, all because she wants to do good and help others as well who have been in similar positions to her. And so that's what you find, is that people really change after the experience, and they become more altruistic, more loving and compassionate towards other people. And so very often they're not centre of their own little world anymore. They see it from the bigger picture and they want to do good in the world, you know. So it's very different then,
But it can also be quite disruptive, can't it?
It can, It can really, you know, cause havoc in people's lives. You know, there's a high divorce rate because people just don't recognize their partners anymore, you know. Again, big career changes as well. So it does have many, many different effects. And people might lose a lot of friends as well because their friends, although they might want to try and help to understand, they don't know how they can help. They don't know how they can understand it. And so they kind of seek out other people or like-minded people who they can talk to, you know. And so friends kind of fall by the wayside as well.
They're big changes, aren't they? The big changes
Oh,
in people's
absolutely.
lives,
Yeah. And, you know, there was one man who had a big, long career in the NHS. And after his near-death experience, he just didn't feel aligned to his job anymore. And he used to get very angry and frustrated at the things he was seeing. And so, you know, he had to get out of that as well. So, yeah, lots of changes there.
And the other thing that, you know, that's quite often mentioned is that, I mean, one of the striking things about near-death experiences is the vividness to which it stays with the person and the sense of it being more real, not less real, and that this life seems less real by comparison.
Yeah, definitely. And what a lot of people describe is that experience is etched into their mind for the rest of their life. And so, you know, they can just close their eyes, instantly they're back in that experience. There's one lady who I used to see quite regularly, and when I used to meet up with her, she'd close her eyes and she said, yeah, I'm back here again. And she'd, you know, she'd have all these tears streaming down her face as well, because it can evoke such emotion as well. You know, the experiences really do evoke that deep emotion. And so I've tried a few men actually who I've tried to interview, and they've contacted me and said, I'd really like to talk about my experience. And I've met with them and they've been unable to express it because they're so overcome with emotion that they're in tears before me and they can't talk about it. So, you know, it's a really, really intense and deep experience for them.
I mean, I've not thought of that, but have you noticed any difference across gender, you know, about how...
No, not really.
No,
it affects them all pretty much the same. Yes, yeah.
Interesting. Then the final area I want to look at, which is, because it starts, I mean, you know, I want to sort of, you know, what I'm struck by your work is your willingness to be open and not to, I think answers are sort of trivial compared to questions. You know, what we need is better questions, you know, answers so often are a bit pat, aren't they? And we're not in a place for answers, but I really like your openness to things. But one of the things that really draws one up short is one starts to edge into the miraculous at times. You know, where, you know, for instance, even Alexander, who, you know, we've mentioned, he shouldn't really be alive, you know, in terms of science. And you've got a story that I was struck by, which shouldn't be able to have happened. That man, I don't know whether...
Again, with patient 10, this was the man who had the out-of-body experience. Further to that, he went upwards into a room, like a pink room, where he met his dead father and his dead mother-in-law. And he'd never really met his mother-in-law before, but recognised her from photos. He was very happy where he was, and he also saw a man who he described could have been Jesus, but he's not sure if it was, because it's not what he would expect Jesus to look like, because his hair was long and scruffy and needed a combing. And
you think of Jesus a bit tiny.
And he said his eyes were piercing, and he was drawn to look at his eyes. And he was happy where he was. He wanted to stay there. But the Jesus type figure said, no, it's not your time. You have to go back. And he said he kind of drifted backwards, watched the image fade in front of his eyes, and then he was back in his body in immediate pain. Now, when I followed up on an interview with him, he misinterpreted one of the questions that I'd asked. And I said to him, is there anything that you could do while out of the body that you can't normally do? And by that, what I meant is that some people will think about a location and they might find themselves there. You know,
interesting.
And that fascinated me. So that's what the kind of thing I was getting at. But he just said, oh no, look, I can open my hand. And I didn't realise the significance at first. And he said, no, he said, my hand is normally like this. So the man has cerebral palsy. So he's 60 years of age at the time of his experience. So for 60 years of his life, his hand had been in that position. And he said, no, I can do that now. I can open it out. And when I discussed this with the physios and the doctor, they said there's no way that should be physically possible because your tendons are going to be in that contracted position. In order to open it out, you'd have to have those tendons released. Well, no such operation was done there. I checked on his notes. He hadn't had any hand physio or anything like that. And so he's gone from being like that to going like that. So how do you explain that, you know? And you know, we can't explain it, but we can't explain it away either. You know, it's happened.
That's right.
So to me, if we had an understanding of that, how many other people are out there with similar ailments and injuries? And, you know, maybe if we understood that, we'd come up with a mechanism that doesn't require surgery. Could save the NHS millions in the long run.
Good. But it moves us into a little bit like miraculous sort of healing, doesn't it? Because you know, I remember nursing people with that, and you know, it is impossible. You know, I remember you try and massage the hand and all that sort of thing.
Yes.
I remember that. You know, you can't without surgery just do that. You know?
Absolutely.
It's literally impossible, sort of thing. You know, and as you say, you can't then say, but it didn't happen because it did. You know.
Yeah, and there are other cases out there. You know, there's David Bennett who had cancer of the bones, I think it was. And, you know, he was literally on his deathbed and he had a near-death experience and he has recovered. He's really going strong now. He features a chapter in the book, The Transformative Power of Near-Death Experiences. There's also the case of Anita Morjani as well, who, again, she was on her deathbed in Hong Kong, in hospital. And they'd called her family in and her brother was travelling to Hong Kong on an aeroplane because she wasn't expected to survive. But she had this near-death experience and completely changed her perception of everything and her understanding of her life. And, you know, she recovered from that as well. So, you know, it's really fascinating and it's something that we don't understand. But, you know, when you come across cases of remarkable healings, rather than people be interested and curious and let's find out more, they're kind of pushed to one side. And,
I bet, yeah.
you know.
Well, they're like an embarrassment.
Yeah, that's it. Because it goes against everything that we know and understand. But imagine if we had people who were more curious out there and we explored those in more depth. You know, it could revolutionise our healthcare as well, you know.
So I want to start to draw on. I mean, I'd love to talk to you more. I mean, I do think it's an important conversation because we were just talking earlier with this. There's so much. Well, I don't know who am I to say, but it's so easy to have a negative view of life, isn't it? To think that there's no meaning. That you know we're just born and we die, and what was the point of that? And you're seeing that more and more in young people, aren't you? That people just feel it's meaningless, and you know, there seems to me a possibility in this discussion to evoke that life has some sort of intrinsic meaning. I don't know whether that's your...
Oh yeah, absolutely. Look around us. Look at the images that we see on social media and on the television. It's all about going out there, spending money on superficial things that don't mean anything and having this great life and people there with big smiles, all this makeup, looking wonderful with this, you know, family around them and all this and that. And life's not like that, is it? You know, it's the image that's been sold to us by the media. And I think people now are starting to kind of wake up a bit as well. You know, we're seeing a lot of people with mental health problems as well. And is it just that all of a sudden people are questioning everything that is being sold to us by the media? Is life more meaningful? Is there something about it? And I think if people are able to go within and start to think of life in a different way, it could really change the way that they live their life as well, you know, because I think a lot of us are not really living our lives. We're existing. We're not living life. You know, life isn't about these long working hours and things. Life is about enjoying your family, being outside and, you know, being with nature. And I think we've kind of lost our way as a society, really. And I think maybe, you know, people are starting to wake up a bit. Let's hope that they are.
Let's hope that they are indeed. So I wanted to finish with a little bit of a sort of personal question. And you've spent so long exploring this, and as I said right at the start, you know, you're just doing that because your own personal, you know, kind of, like you say, obsession almost, fascination. What do you think it's done for you? Has it done? You know, because you've been talking to all these people who have had near-death experiences and death proximate experiences. What do you think it's done for you, as it were, if that's the right question?
Oh, it's done loads for me. It's completely made me reevaluate my life. Whereas before, I think my life was very much about going shopping, buying things all the time, going out, eating out, having nice things to do, but meaningless and superficial things, I think what it's done for me is give me meaning in my life, made me face my own mortality, because I'm not going to be alive forever. So not in this body, as Penny Sartori anyway, So, it's made me appreciate the things that I do have in life, the things that don't cost money, simple things, spending time with my son and, going down to the beach and, walks in nature, things like that. So it's made me very much live more for the present, whereas before I was always kind of looking at my watch. What time is it now? What are we doing? And projecting into the future. Now I think it's very important to be more in the now, and it's made me interested in spiritual practice as well. So I try to do a bit of meditation as well, and really kind of take care of myself as well. So I think it's made me less superficial and enjoy my life more.
And that's a very, very good result, isn't it?
Yeah,
really good
absolutely.
Result. And you've helped us all explore something that hasn't been explored until relatively, and even now there's still a lot more to explore, isn't there? As you say,
Yeah, there is.
A lot more.
There's so many unanswered questions out there. I've literally just scratched the surface. There's so much more out there, and I hope other people are inspired to do their own research as well.
That's great. So that's a great place to finish. Thank you very much, Penny.
Okay.